Make or break day for politics. Super Tuesday. Candidates are out on the trail doing all they can to capture the votes. But let's go to President Obama holding a news conference first.
Going on tonight. But I thought I'd start the day off by taking a few questions, which I'm sure will not be political in nature. But before I do, I want to make a few announcements about some steps we're taking to help responsible homeowners who've been struggling through this housing crisis. Now, we've clearly seen some positive economic news over the last few months. Businesses have created about 3.7 million new jobs over the last 2 years. Manufacturers are hiring for the first time since the 1990s. The auto industry is back and hiring more than 200,000 people over the last few years. Confidence is up, and the economy is getting stronger. But there are still millions of Americans who can't find a job. There are millions more who are having a tough time making the rent or the mortgage, paying for gas or groceries. So our job in Washington isn't to sit back and do nothing, and it's certainly not to stand in the way of the recovery. Right now, we've got to do everything we can to speed it up. Now, Congress did the right thing when they passed part of my jobs plan and prevented a tax hike on 160 million working Americans this year, and that was a good first step. But it's not enough. They can't just stop there and wait for the next election to come around. There are a few things they can do right now that could make a real difference in people's lives. This Congress should, once and for all, end tax breaks for companies that are shipping jobs overseas and use that money to reward companies that are creating jobs here in the United States. I've put forward a proposal that does just that, and there's no reason why Congress can't come together and start acting on it. This Congress could hold a vote on the Buffett rule so that we don't have billionaires paying a lower tax rate than their secretaries. That's just common sense. The vast majority of Americans believe it's common sense, and if we're serious about paying down our deficit, it's as good a place to start as any. And finally, this Congress should pass my proposal to give every responsible homeowner a chance to save an average of $3,000 a year by refinancing their mortgage at historically low rates. No red tape, no runaround from the banks. If you've been on time on your payments, if you've done the right thing, if you've acted responsibly, you should have a chance to save that money on your home. Perhaps to build up your equity or just have more money in your pocket that you can spend on businesses in your community. That would make a huge difference for millions of American families. Now, if Congress refuses to act, I've said that I'll continue to do everything in my power to act without them. Last fall, we announced an initiative that allows millions of responsible homeowners to refinance at low interest rates. Today, we're taking it a step further. We are cutting by more than half the refinancing fees that families pay for loans insured by the Federal Housing Administration. That's going to save the typical family in that situation an extra $1,000 a year on top of the savings that they'd also receive from refinancing. That would make refinancing even more attractive to more families. It's like another tax cut that'll put more money in people's pockets. We're going to do this on our own. We don't need congressional authorization to do it. We're also taking a series of steps to help homeowners who have served our country. It is unconscionable that members of our armed forces and their families have been some of those who have been most susceptible to losing their homes due to the actions of unscrupulous banks and mortgage lenders. Over the last few years, that happened a lot. So as part of the landmark settlement we reached with some of the nation's largest banks a few weeks ago, here's what we're going to do. If you are a member of the armed forces whose home was wrongfully foreclosed, you will be substantially compensated for what the bank did to you and your family. If you are a member of the armed forces with a high interest rate who was wrongfully denied the chance to lower it while you were in active service, which banks are required to do by law, the banks will refund you the money you would have saved along with a significant penalty. The settlement will make sure that you aren't forced into foreclosure just because you have a permanent change in station, but can't sell your home because you owe more than it's worth. Some of the money will also go into a fund that guarantees loans on favorable terms to our veterans. And there will be more foreclosure protections for every man and woman who is currently serving this country in harm's way. As I've said before, no amount of money is going to be enough to make it right for a family who has had their piece of the American dream wrongfully taken away from them. And no action, no matter how meaningful, will entirely heal our housing market on its own. This is not something the government by itself can solve. But I'm not one of those people who believe that we should just sit by and wait for the housing market to hit bottom. There are real things that we can do right now that would make a substantial difference in the lives of innocent, responsible homeowners. That's true in housing, and that's true in any number of different areas when it comes to ensuring that this recovery touches as many lives as possible. That's going to be my top priority as long as I hold this office, and I will do everything I can to make that progress. So with that, I'm going to take some questions, and I will start with Mike Viqueira.
Yes, sir. On the Middle East and as it relates to American politics, a little less than a year ago, Muammar Gaddafi gave a speech and he said he was going to send his forces to Benghazi. He was going to rout opponents from their bedrooms and he was going to shoot them. You frequently cited that speech as a justification for NATO, the no-fly zone, and military action against Libya. In Syria, Bashar al-Assad is killing people. There's a massacre underway. And your critics here in the United States, including most notably John McCain, said you should start airstrikes now. And on Iran, Mitt Romney on Sunday went so far as to say that if you are reelected, Iran will get a bomb and the world will change. How do you respond to this criticism?
All right, Mike, you asked a couple of questions there, so let's start with the Iran situation, since that's been the topic of the news for the last few days. When I came into office, Iran was unified, on the move, had made substantial progress on its nuclear program, and the world was divided in terms of how to deal with it. What we've been able to do over the last 3 years is mobilize unprecedented, crippling sanctions on Iran. Iran is feeling the bite of these sanctions in a substantial way. The world is unified. Iran is politically isolated. And what I have said is that we will not countenance Iran getting a nuclear weapon. My policy is not containment. My policy is to prevent them from getting a nuclear weapon, because if they get a nuclear weapon, that could trigger an arms race in the region. It would undermine our non-proliferation goals. It could potentially fall into the hands of terrorists. And we've been in close consultation with all our allies, including Israel, in moving this strategy forward. At this stage, it is my belief that we have a window of opportunity where this can still be resolved diplomatically. That's not just my view. That's the view of our top intelligence officials. It's the view of top Israeli intelligence officials. And as a consequence, we are going to continue to apply the pressure, even as we provide a door for the Iranian regime to walk through where they could rejoin the community of nations by giving assurances to the international community that they're meeting their obligations and they are not pursuing a nuclear weapon. That's my track record. Now, what's said on the campaign trail, those folks don't have a lot of responsibilities. They're not commander-in-chief. And when I see the casualness with which some of these folks talk about war, I'm reminded of the costs involved in war. I'm reminded of the decision that I have to make in terms of sending our young men and women into battle, and the impacts that has on their lives, the impact it has on our national security, the impact it has on our economy. This is not a game, and there's nothing casual about it. When I see some of these folks who have a lot of bluster and a lot of big talk, but when you actually ask them specifically what they would do, it turns out they repeat the things that we've been doing over the last 3 years. It indicates to me that that's more about politics than actually trying to solve a difficult problem. Now, the one thing that we have not done is we haven't launched a war. If some of these folks think that it's time to launch a war, they should say so. And they should explain to the American people exactly why they would do that and what the consequences would be. Everything else is just talk.
It goes to Syria as well.
With respect to Syria, what's happening in Syria is heartbreaking and outrageous. And what you've seen is the international community mobilize against the Assad regime. And it's not a question of when Assad leaves or if Assad leaves. It's a question of when. He has lost the legitimacy of his people. And the actions that he's now taking against his own people is inexcusable, and the world community has said so in a more or less unified voice. On the other hand, for us to take military action unilaterally, as some have suggested, or to think that somehow there is some simple solution, I think is a mistake. What happened in Libya was we mobilized the international community, had a UN Security Council mandate, had the full cooperation of the region, Arab states, and we knew that we could execute very effectively in a relatively short period of time. This is a much more complicated situation. So what we've done is to work with key Arab states, key international partners. Hillary Clinton was in Tunisia to come together and to mobilize and plan how do we support the opposition, how do we provide humanitarian assistance, how do we continue the political isolation, how do we continue the economic isolation. And we are going to continue to work on this project with other countries. And it is my belief that ultimately this dictator will fall as dictators in the past have fallen. But the notion that the way to solve every one of these problems is to deploy our military, that hasn't been true in the past, and it won't be true now. We've got to think through what we do through the lens of what's going to be effective, but also what's critical for U.S. security interests. Jake Tapper.
Thank you, Mr. President. What kind of assurances did you give Prime Minister Netanyahu about the role that the U.S. would play if diplomacy and economic sanctions fail to work to convince Iran's leaders to change their behavior, and Israel goes ahead and prepares to strike their nuclear facilities? What kind of assurances did you tell him? And shouldn't we, I recognize the difference between debate and bluster, but shouldn't we be having in this country a vigorous debate about what could happen in the case of a Middle East war in a way that sadly we did not do before going into Iraq?
Well, I think there's no doubt that those who are suggesting or proposing or beating the drums of war should explain clearly to the American people what they think the costs and benefits would be. I'm not one of those people, because what I've said is that we have a window through which we can resolve this issue peacefully. We have put forward an international framework that is applying unprecedented pressure. The Iranians just stated that they are willing to return to the negotiating table, and we've got the opportunity, even as we maintain that pressure, to see how it plays out. I'm not going to go into the details of my conversation with Prime Minister Netanyahu, but what I said publicly doesn't differ greatly from what I said privately. Israel is a sovereign nation that has to make its own decisions about how best to preserve its security. And as I said over the last several days, I am deeply mindful of the historical precedents that weigh on any prime minister of Israel when they think about the potential threats to Israel and the Jewish homeland. What I have also said is that because sanctions are starting to have significant effect inside of Iran, and that's not just my assessment, that's, I think, a uniform assessment, because the sanctions are going to be even tougher in the coming months, because they're now starting to affect their oil industry, their central bank, and because we're now seeing noises about them returning to the negotiating table, that it is deeply in everybody's interests, the United States, Israel, and the world's, to see if this can be resolved in a peaceful fashion. And so this notion that somehow we have a choice to make in the next week or 2 weeks or month or 2 months is not borne out by the facts. And the argument that we've made to the Israelis is that we have made an unprecedented commitment to their security. There is an unbreakable bond between our two countries. But one of the functions of friends is to make sure that we provide honest and unvarnished advice in terms of what is the best approach to achieve a common goal, particularly one in which we have a stake. This is not just an issue of Israeli interest. This is an issue of U.S. interest. It's also not just an issue of consequences for Israel if action is taken prematurely. There are consequences to the United States as well. And so I do think that anytime we consider military action, that the American people understand there's going to be a price to pay. Sometimes it's necessary, but we don't do it casually. You know, when I visit Walter Reed, when I sign letters to families that haven't whose loved ones have not come home, I am reminded that there is a cost. Sometimes we bear that cost, but we think it through. We don't play politics with it. When we have in the past, when we haven't thought it through, and it gets wrapped up in politics, we make mistakes. And typically it's not the folks who are popping off who pay the price. It's these incredible men and women in uniform and their families who pay the price. And as a consequence, I think it's very important for us to take a careful, thoughtful, sober approach to what is a real problem. And that's what we've been doing over the last 3 years. That's what I intend to keep doing.
Sir, I'm sorry, if I could just quickly follow up. You didn't, you might not be beating the drums of war, but you did very publicly say, we've got Israel's back. What does that mean?
What it means is that historically we have always cooperated with Israel with respect to the defense of Israel, just like we do with a whole range of other allies, just like we do with Great Britain, just like we do with Japan. And that broad statement, I think, is confirmed when you look at what we've done over the last 3 years on things like Iron Dome that prevents missiles from raining down on their small towns along border regions of Israel that potentially land on schools or children or families. And we're going to continue that unprecedented security commitment. It was not a military doctrine that we were laying out for any particular military action. It was a restatement of our consistent position that the security of Israel is something I deeply care about, and that the deeds of my administration over the last 3 years confirms how deeply we care about it. That's a commitment we've made. Jackie. Where's Jackie? There you are.
Well, with the news this morning that the U.S. and its allies are returning to the table or taking up Iran's offer to talk again, more than a year after those talks broke up in frustration, is this Iran's last chance to negotiate an end to this nuclear question? And you said 3 years ago, nearly 3 years ago, in a similar one-on-one meeting with Prime Minister Netanyahu, that the time for talk, by the end of that year, 2009, you would be considering whether Iran was negotiating in good faith. And you said at that time that we're not going to have talks forever. So here we are nearly 3 years later. Is this it? And did you think you would be here 3 years after those first talks?
You know, there is no doubt that over the last 3 years, when Iran has engaged in negotiations, there has been hemming and hawing and stalling and avoiding the issues in ways that the international community has concluded were not serious. And my expectations, given the consequences of inaction for them, the severe sanctions that are now being applied, the huge toll it's taking on their economy, the degree of isolation that they're feeling right now, which is unprecedented, they understand that the world community means business. To resolve this issue will require Iran to come to the table and discuss in a clear and forthright way how to prove to the international community that the intentions of their nuclear program are peaceful. They know how to do that. This is not a mystery. And so it's going to be very important to make sure that on an issue like this, there are complexities. It obviously has to be methodical. I don't expect a breakthrough in a first meeting, but I think we will have a pretty good sense fairly quickly as to how serious they are about resolving the issue. And there are steps that they can take that would send a signal to the international community and that are verifiable, that would allow them to be in compliance with international norms, in compliance with international mandates, abiding by the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and provide the world an assurance that they're not pursuing a nuclear weapon. They know how to do it. And the question is going to be whether in these discussions they show themselves moving clearly in that direction. Ed Henry.
Thank you, Mr. President. I wanted to follow up on Israel and Iran because you have said repeatedly you have Israel's back. And so I wonder why 3 years in office you have not visited Israel as president. And related to Iran and Israel, you have expressed concern about this loose talk of war, as you call it, driving up gas prices further. Your critics will say on Capitol Hill that you want gas prices to go higher because you have said before that will wean the American people off fossil fuels onto renewable fuels. How do you respond to that?
Ed, just from a political perspective, do you think the President of the United States going into re-election wants gas prices to go up higher? Is there anybody here who thinks that makes a lot of sense? Look, here's the bottom line with respect to gas prices. I want gas prices lower because they hurt families. Because I meet folks every day who have to drive a long way to get to work, and them filling up this gas tank gets more and more painful, and it's a tax out of their pocketbooks, out of their paychecks. And a lot of folks are already operating on the margins right now. And it's not good for the overall economy, because when gas prices go up, consumer spending oftentimes pulls back. And we're in the midst right now of a recovery that is starting to build up steam, and we don't want to reverse it. What I have also said about gas prices is that there is no silver bullet, and the only way we're going to solve this problem over the medium and long term is with an all-of-the-above strategy that says we're going to increase production, which has happened. We are going to make sure that we are conserving energy. That's why we doubled fuel efficiency standards on cars, which will save consumers about $1.7 trillion and take about 12 billion barrels of oil offline, which will help to reduce prices. And we're going to develop clean energy technologies that allow us to continue to use less oil. And we've made progress. I mean, the good news is 2010, first time in a decade that our oil imports were actually below 50%, and they've kept on going down. And we're going to keep on looking at every strategy we can to, yes, reduce the amount of oil that we use while maintaining our living standards and maintaining our productivity and maintaining our economic growth. And we're going to do everything we can to make sure that consumers aren't hurt by it. Now, there's some short-term steps that we're looking at with respect to, for example, there are certain potential bottlenecks in refineries around the country that we've been concerned about. We're concerned about what's happening in terms of production around the world. It's not just what's happening in the Gulf. You've had, for example, in Sudan, some oil that's been taken offline that's helping to restrict supply. So we're going to look at a whole range of measures, including, by the way, making sure that my Attorney General is paying attention to potential speculation in the oil markets. I've asked him to reconstitute a task force that's examining that. But we go through this every year. We've gone through this for 30 years. And if we are going
over a Republican alternative, yet some of them are still disappointed, others upset about a promise that you made on immigration reform that has yet to come to pass. If you are reelected, what would be your strategy? What would you do different to get immigration reform passed through the Congress, especially if both houses continue as they are right now, which is split?
Well, first of all, just substantively, every American should want immigration reform. We've got a system that's broken. We've got a system in which you have millions of families here in this country who are living in the shadows, worried about deportation. You've got American workers that are being undercut because those undocumented workers can be hired and the minimum wage laws may not be observed, overtime laws may not be observed. You've got incredibly talented people who want to start businesses in this country or to work in this country, and we should want those folks here in the United States. But right now, the legal immigration system is so tangled up that it becomes very difficult for them to put down roots here. So we can be a nation of laws and a nation of immigrants. And it is not just a Hispanic issue. This is an issue for everybody. This is an American issue that we need to fix. Now, when I came into office, I said, I am going to push to get this done. We didn't get it done. And the reason we haven't gotten it done is because what used to be a bipartisan agreement that we should fix this ended up becoming a partisan issue. I give a lot of credit to my predecessor, George Bush, and his political advisors who said, this should not be just something the Democrats support. The Republican Party is invested in this as well. That was good advice then. It would be good advice now. And my hope is that after this election, the Latino community will have sent a strong message that they want a bipartisan effort to pass comprehensive immigration reform that involves making sure we've got tough border security. And this administration has done more for border security than just about anybody. That we are making sure that companies aren't able to take advantage of undocumented workers. That we've got strong laws in place, and that we've got a path so that all those folks whose kids often are U.S. citizens, who are working with us, living with us, and in our communities, and not breaking the law, and trying to do their best to raise their families, that they've got a chance to be a fuller part of our community. So, what do I think will change? Well, what I will do, look, we're going to be putting forward, as we have done before, a framework, a proposal, legislation that can move the ball forward and actually get this thing done. But ultimately, I can't vote for Republicans. They're going to have to come to the conclusion that this is good for the country and that this is something that they themselves think is important. And depending on how Congress turns out, we'll see how many Republican votes we need to get it done. Nora O'Donnell, how are you?
Thank you, Mr. President. Today is Super Tuesday, so I wonder if you might weigh in on some of your potential Republican opponents. Mitt Romney has criticized you on Iran and said hope is not a foreign policy. He also said that you are America's most feckless president since Carter.
Yeah.
What would you like to say to Mr. Romney?
Good luck tonight.
No, really.
Really? Lynn, since you've been hollering and you're from my hometown, make it a good one.
My question is about the switch of the G8 summit from Chicago to Camp David. A reason given from the White House is that now you wanted a more intimate summit. People in Chicago would like to know, what do you know now that you did not know when you booked hometown Chicago for the G8 that led to the switch? And what role did security threats possibly play in the decision?
Well, keep in mind, Lynn, we're still going to be showing up with a whole bunch of world leaders. We've got this NATO summit. Typically what's happened is that we've tried to attach the G8 summit to the NATO summit so that the leaders in the G8 summit don't have to travel twice to whatever location. So last year in France, we combined a G8 with a NATO summit. We'll do so again. I have to say, this was an idea that was brought to me after the initial organizing of the NATO summit. Somebody pointed out that I hadn't had any of my counterparts who I've worked with now for 3 years up to Camp David. G8 tends to be a more informal setting in which we talk about a wide range of issues in a pretty intimate way. And the thinking was that people would enjoy being in a more casual backdrop. I think the weather should be good that time of year. It'll give me a chance to spend time with Mr. Putin, the new Russian president. And from there, we will then fly to Chicago. I always have confidence in Chicago being able to handle security issues. Whether it's Taste of Chicago or Lollapalooza or Bulls Championships, we know how to deal with a crowd. And I'm sure that your new mayor will be quite attentive to detail in making sure that everything goes off well. All right? Okay. Go ahead. Last one.
Thank you.
Last question.
Thank you. Mr. President, just to continue on that, when the NATO leaders gather in Chicago in May, do you expect that they'll be able to agree on a transition strategy? And are you concerned at all that the Koran burning and the episodes that have followed since then threaten your ability to negotiate with partners?
Well, keep in mind that the transition policy was in place and established at Lisbon. And we've been following that strategy that calls for us turning over increasing responsibility to Afghans and a full transition so that our combat role is over by the end of 2014. And our coalition partners have agreed to it. They are sticking with it. That continues to be the plan. What we are now going to be doing over the next, at this NATO meeting and planning for the next 2 years, is to make sure that that transition is not a cliff, but that there are benchmarks and steps that are taken along the way in the same way that we reduced our role in Iraq so that it is gradual, Afghan capacity is built, the partnering with Afghan security forces is effective, that we are putting in place the kinds of support structures that are needed in order for the overall strategy to be effective. Now, yes, the situation with the Koran burning concerns me. I think that it is an indication of the challenges in that environment, and it's an indication that now is the time for us to transition. Obviously, the violence directed at our people is unacceptable, and President Karzai acknowledged that. But what is also true is President Karzai, I think, is eager for more responsibility on the Afghan side. We're going to be able to find a mechanism whereby Afghans understand their sovereignty is being respected and that they're going to be taking a greater and greater role in their own security. That, I think, is in the interest of Afghans. It's also in our interests. And I'm confident we can execute, but it's not going to be a smooth path. There are going to be bumps along the road, just as there were in Iraq.
Well, are these bumps along the road, or are you seeing a deterioration in the relationship based on the Koran burning itself, the violence that has followed, that inhibits your ability to work out things like how to hand off the detention center?
No, none of this stuff is easy, and it never has been. And obviously, the most recent riots or protests against the Quran burning were tragic. But remember, this happened a while back when a pastor in Florida threatened to burn a Quran. In Iraq, as we were making this transition, there were constant crises that would pop up and tragic events that would take place, and there would be occasional setbacks. But what I've tried to do is to set a course, make sure that up and down the chain of command, everybody knows what our broader strategy is. And one of the incredible things about our military is that when they know what our objective is, what our goal is, regardless of the obstacles that they meet along the way, they get the job done. And I think that President Karzai understands that we are interested in a strategic partnership with the Afghan people and the Afghan government. We are not interested in staying there any longer than is necessary to assure that al-Qaeda is not operating there and that there is sufficient stability that it doesn't end up being a free-for-all after ISAF has left. And so we share interests here. It'll require negotiations, and there will be time where things don't look as smooth as I'd like. That's kind of the deal internationally on a whole range of these issues. All right? Thank you, guys. Oh, can I just make one other comment? I want to publicly express condolences to the family of Donald Payne, congressman from New Jersey, a wonderful man, did great work both domestically and internationally. He was a friend of mine, and so my heart goes out to his family and to his colleagues. All right?
And you have been listening to the president here. This is the first formal news conference he has given since last October, answering all kinds of questions. He began by speaking specifically about the economy here on this Super Tuesday, talking economy, talking about how he can perhaps help current and former members of the military if they were wronged by being foreclosed upon, and also talking specifically about people with FHA loans, government-backed loans, how they can be helped as well. So he began with that, but then it was an open floor, and people within that room got to ask him all kinds of questions. And if I can, I'd like to bring in Wolf Blitzer and Gloria Borger. And, you know, a lot was discussed, but I want to begin with something we've been talking about a lot the last couple of days, specifically his meeting, the president's meeting with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu yesterday. And I think it's also just significant to point out the fact that it is Super Tuesday, right? So this is the day of Super Tuesday that he's coming out and giving this first news conference. And it's also the day after he meets with Prime Minister Netanyahu. That is significant, strategically speaking, because why?
You know, he really went after his Republican challengers on the whole issue of Israel and Iran. He spoke about the casualness that some of these Republican presidential candidates, I think he's specifically referring to Mitt Romney, are talking about the possibility of war with Iran right now. He spoke about the pain of a war. He underscored his commitment to Israel. He has Israel's back, but he says there is another opportunity to try to resolve this through diplomacy, through sanctions, through economic pressure. And he says for these Republicans, it's all bluster. He says this is not a game. He says they have a lot of bluster. They have big talks, but when it comes down to the end, they're not proposing anything serious at all. So that was his indirect criticism of these Republican candidates.
What did you hear?
Well, the same exact thing. And he also said, if some of these folks think it's time to launch a war, they should say so to the American people. Because it's very clear he understands where the American people are in terms of launching another war. And it's very easy to saber rattle when you're not sitting in the Oval Office. He talked about going to Walter Reed and what he has to do when he signs those letters to parents. And then when he was asked about Mitt Romney, he said, and Super Tuesday, he said, good luck tonight.
And there was a bit of laughter, and he said, no, really, good luck tonight.
Well,
the line that really jumped out at me when he was talking about Walter Reed, he said, talking about the cost and sacrifice of war, which the American people know all too well, he said, it's not the people we're popping off who pay the price, it's those families losing loved ones who are paying the price. But again, reiterating, and he was asked to define, what does that mean? Israel, we've got your back. But talking about those crippling sanctions on Iran, they're already seeing the effects when it comes to oil, the central bank. Now they're hearing Iranians perhaps being willing to go back to the negotiating table. How do you think that resonates with Americans listening to this today?
He did make the point that when it came to the current assessment, whether there was still a window, an opportunity to resolve this
diplomatically,
he says there was consensus in the U.S. intelligence community, and his words were specific. He said there was a consensus in the Israeli intelligence community that there was still a window. And I think that probably is a consensus between, if you take a look at what the CIA believes, what the Israeli intelligence community, Mossad believes, there probably is a consensus. I don't think there's necessarily a consensus between what President Obama believes and what Prime Minister Netanyahu himself. I think there is a little bit of a disagreement there. Not a whole lot. They basically agree Iran should not be able to get
But the
a
timing
nuclear
they seem
bomb.
to disagree upon.
But the Israelis would like the ratcheting up of the pressures, and they're much more skeptical about that the sanctions are really going to work. They're also much more skeptical about these resumed negotiations with the Iranians.
Well, when he says there's a window, we also don't know how much of a window he believes there is and how much of a window the Israelis believe there is. And he was asked a very good question, which is that 3 years ago, the president was essentially saying, we need to give diplomacy a chance to work. And he was asked the question generally, what has changed? And the answer is, well, we've applied more sanctions and we're going to continue to apply more sanctions, but to what end?
He talked, and I want to just get to a soundbite, because to your point about, visiting with soldiers at Walter Reed and the fact that we're, winding down Afghanistan, the war is over in Iraq. Here's what he said about thinking about a casual war.
Those folks don't have a lot of responsibilities. They're not commander-in-chief. And when I see the casualness with which some of these folks talk about war, I'm reminded of the costs involved in war. I'm reminded of the decision that I have to make in terms of sending our young men and women into battle, and the impacts that has on their lives, the impact it has on our national security, the impact it has on our economy. This is not a game. There's nothing casual about it. When I see some of these folks who have a lot of bluster and a lot of big talk, but when you actually ask them specifically what they would do, it turns out they repeat the things that we've been doing over the last 3 years.
Do you think his response would be any different if this were not an election year?
I think his response would be the same, and that he wants more time. He's not anxious for the U.S. to launch military strikes to try to take out Iran's nuclear facilities. He's certainly not anxious for Israel to launch military strikes. He wants that to be the absolute bottom line, last alternative, only if 100% necessary to prevent Iran from having a nuclear bomb. Israel's so-called green line, red line, whatever you want to call it, is a little bit different. Israel says they shouldn't have the capability to build a nuclear bomb, so they're much less generous in terms of the time frame, but it's a serious issue, and I suspect the president, he's looking at the elections, he's saying, what he thinks is popular stuff, but, he's very concerned about a war.
I got the feeling today, and when the president said, when it gets wrapped up in politics, we make mistakes, I get the feeling, although he didn't come out and say it, is that he thinks it's a dangerous conversation to be having in the political arena right now.
I feel like, though, as part of this conversation, there's also Syria, right? He was asked about Syria. He says it's not a matter of if, but when Bashar al-Assad goes away. He said it absolutely is a massacre. It's heartbreaking. But it was interesting. You and I were talking about Senator McCain, right, on the Senate floor yesterday, calling for U.S. airstrikes in Syria. And we don't know how that would perhaps resonate within the Obama administration. But, with regard to Libya, he said they had full cooperation within the region. Syria, he specifically said, is much more complicated. But beyond that,
it's a problem for him explaining the differences between Libya and Syria. In Libya, there was a potential of a slaughter in Benghazi. The opposition to Gaddafi was there. And the U.S., together with Arab friends in the Arab League, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, as well as the international community. They got a resolution through the UN Security Council calling for a no-fly zone that NATO would implement over Libya, a naval blockade, if you will, almost a no-drive zone. Cruise missiles started going in and taking out air defense systems in Libya, and we know what happened a few months later. He says it's much more complicated, in his words, in Syria right now. There isn't unanimity in the UN Security Council. Russia and China are blocking a resolution. The Arab League has not done the same thing this time. And he says unilateral U.S. military action, I'm reading from my notes, is a mistake, even though it is, as you point out, heartbreaking and outrageous what Bashar al-Assad's regime is doing. So he disagrees with John McCain on this sensitive issue, but I suspect that the U.S. is going to continue to try to put the pressure on the Chinese and the Russians to support some sort of resolution. NATO has been sort of, as I used the word the other day when I interviewed the NATO Secretary General Rasmussen, I said to him, NATO's been impotent right now. They did the job in Libya. They're not doing anything.
And he
in
said
Syria.
they don't want to get involved.
He says
right?
we're not. It's a very different situation. And he, you know, he was. He wasn't making a very compelling case, I gotta say.
And John McCain also called for unilateral action, if you'll recall, in Libya. He was out there doing that, and of course the president waited until he got all of the pieces together. And you don't really hear the Republican presidential candidates out there echoing John McCain, do you?
Yeah, he's ahead of the curve on that one.
Let me bring in Jessica Yellen, our chief White House correspondent. She got a question, and forgive me, Jessica, because I was running upstairs to put my microphone and earpiece in. I understand you did ask about everything that's happened that's been percolating over the last couple of days with regard to Rush Limbaugh and this Georgetown law student and the names he's called her, and now this sort of war on women. Tell me what you asked. What was his response?
I asked if the president agrees with the argument that some top Democrats have been making that there is a war on women. And he fundamentally avoided answering the question. And I asked, Republicans contend that it's more like Democrats are lodging a war for the women's vote. So it was one of the more political answers he gave in the press conference. But if I could make the larger point, Brooke, he was asked about Rush Limbaugh, and he said he didn't want to address, someone else asked that, address what's in Rush Limbaugh's heart. One of the advantages, I guess, for the president, disadvantages for the press when they hold this few press conferences is when you do have one, there are so many questions that nobody gets to ask. And I'd point out that there were very few questions about the economy. He really didn't get asked that many other questions about, for example, his home foreclosure plan that he announced today. If I had a chance to ask him a second question, I really would have asked him, why is it that if this is so important, it took you 3 years to roll out this plan? Brooke, I'd point out that 3 years into his administration, there are almost as many houses underwater as there were at the beginning of the administration, and he has rolled out more than 10 housing refinance plans in that time. So what's taken, you know, why isn't this something of a failure to date? And there's all sorts of questions about the unemployment rate and other issues that he just didn't have to answer because it was so foreign policy centered, Brooke.
I'm glad you brought that up, because my question would have been, what didn't you hear? Jessica Yellen, thank you. And just sort of final thoughts here. I know we were, you know, Suzanne was talking to Allison Cossack, and to the point about, you know, yes, this program that he's proposing that would affect, you know, those with FHA, you know, loans and the former or current military members, that's only 2 to 3 million people. That doesn't include the millions of others, right, who are underwater, who are paying their mortgages, but they're kind of stuck.
I think what the administration would say to that is, you know, we've asked Congress to do more, but Congress hasn't acted on it. And I think one of the reasons, politically, in answer to Jessica's point, actually, is that they're doing this now for political reasons, of course, which is that they can then take this and run against Congress. And I think if Jessica had gotten asked that question, he certainly wouldn't have said that. But that's clearly the case.
I thought the president was most compelling and most moving when he spoke about why he made that phone call to that Georgetown University law student, to reassure her parents that what she did, you can disagree with her on the substance when she testified before Congress and expressed her views. What she did was, he would like to see his daughters, Sasha and Malia, do that. He might disagree with them, but he'd like to do that but he wouldn't want them or her, that Georgetown University law student, to be called a vile, ugly name, as Rush Limbaugh did. And I thought that's when the president came through. He didn't have to pick up the phone and call her, but he did, and I thought that was a compelling part of the news conference.
Wolf and Gloria, thank you both. We'll be talking later in the show about Super Tuesday. Meantime,
see you later tonight.
See you later tonight. Meantime, we got a lot more to cover for you here in the next 2 hours, including this. Super Tuesday. Here we go.
Why didn't you call me?
He will be the weakest candidate.
As the rhetoric flies, we're going to break down what's important and what's not. Also, why Ohio is the big prize. More advertisers and another radio station bail on Rush Limbaugh. But find out why his brand is probably safe. Plus, a stunner in a murder mystery.
There she was, slumped over the steering wheel.
An Iranian-born college student is found dead, and for the first time, police say it could be an assassination. And one guy is so fed up with the price of popcorn at the movie theater, he's suing.